to the Remington Podcast, where we take a deep dive into all things ammunition. I'm your host, Audrey Mays, and today I'm sitting down with Research and Development Engineer Leland Mason.
How's it going, guys?
And we're here to talk about the Bad 44 Magnum.
I love the Marty Robbins reference.
Had to do it. It's iconic.
Heck yeah.
So let's just dive right into it. Mm-hmm. You know where we always start. What is the history of the 44 Magnum?
Well, 44 Magnum, very prominent cartridge nowadays. Probably, arguably, one of the big three for revolver cartridges in mass production today. 44 Magnum, 357 Magnum, and then you probably would argue 38 Special. Mm-hmm. But anyways, 44 Magnum has its roots back in 1956 as developed by the man, the myth, the legend, Elmer Keith. And Elmer Keith was also the individual who developed the 357 Magnum. So pretty prolific individual as far as ammunition introductions go.
Yeah, a lot of namesakes
there.
Oh,
yeah. And similarly to what he did with the 38 Special to 357 Magnum, he took 41 Special, also a Remington cartridge, though, 41 Magnum, that is. But he took the 44 Special and introduced 44 Magnum. Mm-hmm. So, quick brief history of it. When he originally adopted the idea, he wanted it to be called 44 Special Magnum. And a lot of names and stuff going through my head. Anyway, when he did that, the intent was a 250 grain bullet traveling at 1,200 feet per second, which for the time was very healthy and was purpose-built basically for taking large animals with a revolver. So, his intent was basically white-tailed deer, and like large white-tailed deer, other than, with something like a 38 Special or a 44 Special. You wouldn't necessarily want to, harvest game with something like that and be very confident that you're going to have an ethical shot just because of the energy, right?
Yeah, not that I wouldn't say like the 44 Magnum was the birth of handgun hunting, because it definitely wasn't.
No,
but
it was a trailblazer.
It's kind of the namesake now.
Heck,
I would say.
It is.
Yeah,
absolutely, and it's still, as strong as it's ever been as far as new cartridge development and production. At Remington, we have multiple offerings. We've been doing it for years. We invented the cartridge,
right?
44 Magnum.
44 Remington Magnum.
That's correct. 44 Remington Magnum. And anyways, so, Keith's formula, like I said, was that 250 grain bullet at 1,200 feet per second. Well, he was, at the time, pretty prominent with introductions of cartridges, and approached Remington and pitched the idea to them, as well as Smith & Wesson. Mm-hmm. So obviously you've got a cartridge, you need a gun. That's typically how things are developed. If you don't have a gun that is designed from the ground up to chamber a new cartridge, you have a firearm that's, released in pair with this new.
Right.
It's like a platform that's released with this new cartridge.
Yeah.
Well, anyways.
A great example is Remington released 360 buck hammer in conjunction with Henry.
100%. Yeah. That's exactly how it works. Mm-hmm. So typically. So similarly to how it worked with Elmer, when he got both sides to bite, Remington, undertook the development of this 44 Special Magnum, essentially what it was, soon to become 44 Remington Magnum. And Smith & Wesson undertook development of it to produce the first prototype revolver. So everybody knows Dirty Harry, right?
Mm-hmm. Like Clint Eastwood.
Do you feel lucky, punk? Oh,
yeah.
It's everybody knows it.
Classic.
Good movie. Yep. Well, and also at the time, he's like the most powerful handgun revolver in the world, all that stuff, or revolver cartridge in the world.
And people still believe that because of that movie.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Which is, of course, nowadays been very much eclipsed by some even more powerful handgun cartridges. Not to say that 44 is a slouch, because it is absolutely not. No.
Yeah.
But the Smith & Wesson Model 29 is the one that everybody knows. That's the big, blued metal, walnut gripped revolver that he had in Dirty Harry. Mm-hmm. But the actual first production revolver was made by Ruger.
Yeah.
Okay. And that was the Black Hawk, which is their, take on the single action revolver. And there is a little story out there.
There's some tea.
Yeah. and it's rumors. There's also a couple other rumors, but the one that's most prominent to us is that there were Remington employees sending Bill Ruger himself 44 Magnum cartridges from development under the table, more or less, for them to develop this Ruger. And you know, whether or not it's true, Ruger beat Smith to the market. But the Model 29 Smith is what got all the fame. So anyways, there is that. But going back to Elmer Keith, his intent was to make this cartridge great for use in handgun hunting. He also developed, in pair with his, his introductions of all these cartridges and designs for revolvers, introduced the Keith bullet. So,
which is pretty iconic. I mean, when you say Keith bullet, people usually know what shape you're talking about.
People know what a Keith is, and it's still used today. I mean, you go and look at like the big hard casts bullets profiles. Even some of the profiles that we make here are Keith, and for good reason. So what is a Keith? So you have a wad cutter, which is a cylinder, basically, right? It's designed to shoot paper, leave a very clean hole punched hole, looks great when you're target shooting. Ballistically, a little bit to be desired, except you're going to be shooting this at close ranges. Then you have a semi-wad cutter, which is a pretty thinned out, maybe a little bit more profiled version of a wad cutter. The intent of that being better ballistics, right? Not necessarily either of them being designed for extreme terminal performance necessarily, which, by the way, if you've ever kind of on a side note, maybe to contradict myself, if you're interested, you ought to look up and research wad cutter terminal ballistics. So like when you shoot something, organic membrane with a big flat frontal surface, it does absolutely extreme damage. It's like ridiculous. But like I said, external ballistics, right? Trajectories and such is, it's just not what it's designed for.
It wasn't the intent. That doesn't mean it's not what it does.
That's correct. Yeah. Exactly. Well, the Keith takes a little bit of both. So you have your semi-wad cutter, normal profile, really small frontal nose, right? And you have to, in order to keep a bullet of the same grain weight, add that lead somewhere, right? These are all lead bullets,
right?
Okay. You can't add it into the nose, because then point of having that semi-wad cutter is to take some of that profile into the bullet and take a little bit of weight out of the nose and give it more of an ogive, more distinct ogive at least.
Ogive being angle.
Yeah, the whole, basically the front of the bullet, the curve, right? Not necessarily the front, that'd be the me-plat, but the curve. Anyways, the Keith was basically a really full profiled semi-wad cutter. So what it allowed him to do was take a bullet of a similar grain weight and remove weight from the heel of the bullet. Okay, so in hand loading, especially with 44 Magnum, revolver guys love to hand load this stuff, right?
Yeah. And
rightfully so. There's a lot of capabilities in any revolver cartridge, 44 Magnum, probably arguably the most so. But when you get into hand loading and load development, in our case at Remington, you start to see the value in meeting these higher trajectory numbers, right? Not trajectories rather, but higher numbers, velocities, but still maintaining safe pressure. Well, when you start taking up your case volume, that bullet gets longer, you start to eat away your potential. Well, he was smart, and he put as much lead as he could up in the front while still giving it a more aerodynamic shape. Took some of the lead out of the heel of the bullet and allowed for the use of larger quantities of powder while also using slower burning powders. So generally said, it's not a rule of thumb necessarily. You could say that, but it's not a overarching rule. You use a slower powder, you're going to get higher velocities at the muzzle, right? It's more of a long shove instead of a quick kick.
Would it be like more even as well if it was slower?
Potentially.
Okay.
Right. Potentially. There's a ton of internal ballistics that goes on to develop or to determine how powder burns, how efficiently it burns, and all that. But in general, if you use a slower burning powder, you get faster muzzle velocity. So, and the intent of a handgun hunting cartridge, we're not talking about somebody necessarily using a 44 Magnum for self-defense. It's not, you could definitely do that, but that's not necessarily what it was initially designed for. You're not going to be carrying a 2-inch barrel 44 mag.
Right.
You're going to be carrying a big 5 or 6-inch hunting revolver nowadays, potentially with a scope.
Yeah.
And you can get away with that longer velocity.
That you most often would rest on something, I would hope.
Heck
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So you can get away with these slower burning powders with a Keith bullet, have a little bit better trajectories, external ballistics. So that was the intent there. And then again, with all these Magnum cartridges and this bullet design, he was a pretty prolific individual for that. So anyways, nowadays, like I said, we still use that. I mean, there's new cartridges within, or not new cartridges, but new loads within 44 Magnum that are being designed to use Keith bullets for their lasting effect and that they are effective. So, Yep. And then, something else I was going to add too, a lot of times you hear people talk about this whole naming convention with 44s, right?
Well, that's what I was going to ask, right?
Yeah.
So 44 Magnum, back in the day when people used to shoot like patch and ball, 44 caliber patch and ball, that was pretty normal. Or is it the same?
That's 44, right?
Yeah.
It's 440 thousandths
Specifically,
right?
Yeah.
It's not, and that's kind of what we've seen a lot of times, and you see in the ammunition industry, is that the name doesn't necessarily tell you exactly everything. Caliber is the diameter of the projectile, not the name, right? So like the caliber in 44 Magnum, the caliber is actually 429, so 429 thousandths of an inch. And the reason is because 44 Magnum is its parent cartridge is 44 Special. 44 Special's parent cartridge is 44 Russian. So 44 Russian was designed back in, very late, kind of mid to late 1800s. I think it was like 1860.
Okay, yeah.
And back in the day then, cartridges had a heeled bullet. So think 22 long rifle, also developed in similar times.
Yeah.
So when you look at a 40 or a 22, right, the bullet's the same diameter as the case. It was the same thing. So back then, 44 Russian, that name stuck because that was the outside diameter of the bullet. But nowadays, when 44 Special and Magnum were developed, the bullet is not the same diameter as the case. It's smaller. It's recessed. It fits inside,
right?
Like a modern.
Usually neck it down,
right?
Yeah.
And then therefore now you have 429 bullets. So that's where that came from. So, anyways, just kind of another weird naming convention that goes off of seemingly random numbers and whatnot, but there is some kind of interesting history behind that. So.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned, we came out with core-locked handgun, the core-locked bullet, and that everyone loves, right? And then
100%.
We use that for handgun hunting, obviously. That's what it's optimized for. That's what you're supposed to use it for. But what else would people normally use a 44 Magnum for?
Well, I know there's a lot of people in the self-defense industry who use 44 Magnum as a good baseline for like home defense. Okay, so like there are multiple people who like 44 Magnum as kind of that stopgap between a rifle and like your typical handgun. 44 Magnum, without a doubt, has way more energy than a 9mm or 40 Smith & Wesson 45 ACP, any of that stuff. And with the proper bullet, which we have terminally expanding bullets designed for self-defense through our HTP line, then you can utilize that. So you get the power, more or less, of a, really, really strong handgun, but in the convenience of a handgun.
Right.
You're not using it as like a pistol caliber carbine or even a rifle in that case. A lot of people can't get along with having a rifle where they sleep. It's just not, logistically practical. And it's also, you got to consider where that energy, the extreme energy you're going to get from a rifle is going to go. So anyway, there's uses there. And then also in defense. So, defense meaning like wildlife defense. So very commonly, we just finished our 10mm episode. Similarly to 10mm, people tend to go after 44s for, deep penetrating projectiles used in, grizzly bear defense and, Kodiaks and all that kind of stuff. So, excellent cartridge for that. Tons and tons of firearm options for 44 Magnum. And another one that's fairly common, maybe more so a little bit back in the day, but it's still very much a viable option for this nowadays is something like a ranch rifle, right? So like, Ruger and Marlin and a lot of other companies have come out with firearms that are carbines chambered in this rimmed, cartridge, as well as nowadays, even more popular, the lever action. And with the lever action boom that's going on now, you get a more modern performing cartridge, right? 1956 is not that old.
They perform a little better. They feel nicer probably when you pull the trigger.
Oh yeah. And you still get, good performance. Like I said, Elmer Keith's original formula was a 250 grain bullet at 1,200 feet per second. Well, Remington, when they developed it, were actually able to hit and exceed that number significantly. So the standard, which you can still see nowadays, it's probably the most popular load, factory load at least, is a 240 grain at 1,500 feet per second. It's pretty substantial.
Yeah. And a lot of people wonder sometimes why, when they look at like our catalog or when they look on our website, sometimes we say things on this podcast like, oh, the velocity is 1,500, the muzzle velocity. And they're like, well, that's not what it says on your website.
Yeah. It's like way lower.
Yeah.
Super anemic.
But people need to understand that we test some things out of something called vented barrels.
Yep. So vented barrels are a SAMI controlled barrel configuration. A little bit less common nowadays. Primarily, we use them for reporting numbers because it's going to be most accurate to what an individual who would purchase our ammunition off the shelf, shooting it through a revolver, would notice or observe, right? So vented barrel is exactly what it sounds like. With a revolver, you have a cylinder and a barrel, and the forcing cone is what the bullet is going to enter as it goes into the barrel.
Right. And
you're going to have a mechanical gap between the two. It's how the cylinder has to, revolve. And through that gap, and, this is no news to, 99% of the people watching this podcast, because consumers are very educated nowadays, you lose gas through that cylinder gap.
Correct.
That's why you don't want to put your fingers right next to the cylinder when you pull the trigger, especially not on a 44. And anyways, in order to properly, advertise the velocities and more practically to our consumers, we advertise our revolver cartridges through vented barrels. And it's just a little bit more accurate. I mean, you go and shoot them out of a similarly barreled revolver, you're going to see very similar, numbers. Because then on the other flip side, it might look anemic on paper, but you could, hear 1,500 feet per second and be like, oh my gosh, and then go shoot it out of your 4-inch, backpacking gun and be like, what the heck,
Yeah.
And it's just the platform.
Yeah.
Right?
It's the same thing with barrel length. That's important to look at when you're looking at our velocities versus the velocities that you're getting.
Yep.
They're going to be different.
Yep.
We
100%.
test things under the same spec for a reason.
Yep. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it controls, and it just ends up being a more predictable and higher quality product for the consumer.
Yeah. So back to the Remington offerings, we have at least 3 that I know of. Can you tell me a little bit about the core-locked handgun?
Yeah, so the core-locked handgun, we offer that bullet's a semi-jacketed hollow point. We've tested it through terminal performance and all kinds of terminal testing that we've done on it. Gel testing has been extremely positive. The cartridge, we've had people report back in reviews that they have taken it hunting, and it's a super viable caliber or load for that rather. And then not only in the core-locked handgun hunting, but we offer, HTP. So you have offerings from us being your HTP line, right? So your fully jacketed hollow point, your semi-jacketed hollow point with the core-locked handgun hunting, and then you've got a wad cutter and a semi-wad cutter. So for those that are wanting to shoot their revolvers a little bit more on a target basis, then you're going to use those semi-jacketed and then not the semi-jacketed, but the semi-wad cutter and wad cutter offerings. So a little bit of expanse there. Core-locked handgun hunting is obviously designed for hunting, right? Those soft point bullets, even the semi-jacketed hollow points are really designed for soft skin game, right? Extreme expansion with very, very sufficient penetration like I said, optimize for your white-tailed deer like Keith intended it.
Yeah. I mean, you're going to shoot a whitetail with it. I mean, maybe you could, if you're super skilled, shoot an elk or anything with it. Whitetail is kind of the goal, though.
Yeah.
It was the goal when it was made.
That was its intended design. Yeah. Right. And you could definitely get away with that. I mean, your performance window that you're delivering on a whitetail deer, you're like very healthy. So you got room to go. Like, keep going up. Keep going up.
Yeah. But you're not really a hunter guy, but I feel like because you're a super handgun enthusiast, so if you picked up.
Oh, it would be my go-to.
Yeah. 100%. You're like, if I'm going to hunt, I'm going to hunt with a handgun.
I'm going to hunt with a handgun. That's like
it is going to happen.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. So, and that's a no-brainer for me because I like guns.
Right.
And I want to use something that I'm really interested in. And I think hunting with a handgun, as we've said many times on this podcast, is like the ultimate skill. Mm-hmm. It's kind of a show-off. It's like I just shot at an animal that is larger than myself, fed myself and my family or whatever, but I did it with a handgun, which handguns, in my opinion, are the hardest to master and arguably can't be mastered just because of the platform, right? But anyways, what I was going to get at with the Core-Lokt handgun hunting is that you can also utilize that very easily into self-defense situations. It's an adaptable load.
And, if you, like you said, are hiking or something in the wilderness and you need to carry some kind of self-defense, not only against two-legged creatures, but also against four-legged creatures.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. It's a perfect load for that. If I, knowing that, loads potential through development, if I was a backpacker with a 44, that would probably be my go-to just because of, the design of it being intended for larger animals.
Yeah. I mean, it's a big like blowback cartridge.
Oh, yeah.
That's why I would stick with a 10 mil personally.
Yeah. Oh, you shoot a 44, like a full power 240 at 1,500 feet per second 44 Magnum. That gun's going to be pointing directly in the air when you're done shooting the thing.
Yeah, for sure. If you're going to carry that thing for self-defense, shoot it first.
Oh, yeah.
Just so you know. Like,
get out there, just like with any gun and any ammo. It's good to get out there and familiarize yourself because it is an animal. So. Yeah,
it's a doozy, but... specifically because it's a handgun cartridge and handguns are harder to handle in general because you only have 1 to 2 points of contact. Yeah. Then
it's good to train.
It's good to
familiarize yourself. Yeah. Because if you went hunting, God forbid, you've shot that gun before. But if you went hiking even and you intended to use that for self-defense or whatever, and you torched that sucker off the first time, you just made a bad situation probably even scarier.
And like maybe worse, to be honest. Yeah.
Yeah, so that would not be good.
Yeah. No. Definitely. Do you have a 44?
I don't, but it's actually like second on my list right now.
Okay,
so,
gotcha.
I got a couple models I'm looking at. And it's funny you said that because I have, a few little personal accounts that I like put money towards for guns. It fluctuates as the year goes, but the 44 Magnum moved up towards the end of this year because I went and I was shooting one of my friends and I was like, man, this is just like, you shoot this thing, it'll put some hair on your chest. I love it.
Oh my gosh. Do you feel lucky, punk? That's like literally what you just, oh my gosh, that's so funny. Yeah, any other thoughts about the 44 Magnum?
No, great cartridge, very healthy. Very prominent, and honestly, as far as factory loads go, there are more powerful handgun cartridges out there, but it's hard to beat. Availability is good, and it's hard to argue that there are more revolvers chambered in 44 Magnum than most other Magnum revolver cartridges, maybe except 357. So, very prominent, very very healthy, and it's got a lot left in it. And I also will say that, from a research and development standpoint, we're keeping up with that. We got a lot of things coming down the pipe for it. So
innovation's not dead in terms of the 44. We're moving on up.
That's right.
And it's always fun to talk about, Remington cartridges. So I'm glad we got to cover the 44.
Good old 44 Rem-Mag.
Well, there you have it, guys. Remington is on the rise. Like, comment, subscribe, and be sure to share this podcast with your hunting or shooting buddies. If you have any questions for me or Leland here, you can email us at podcast@remington.com. Thanks for listening.